Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another edition of Virtual Museum from the National Museum of Industrial History. Today, we're lucky to be joined by Martha Capwell-Fox, who is the Historian and Archives Coordinator for the National Canal Museum and the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor since 2012. She's a professional writer and editor, and she's worked at magazine publishing at National Geographic and Rodale, and has published 4 books on local historical topics. Her most recent book, Geography, Geology, and Genius, How Coal and Canals Ignited the American Industrial Revolution, is the subject of today's talk. She's a graduate of American University with a dual degree in international relations and U.S. history. She's part of our virtual museum program, as I mentioned, and we have a couple other great programs coming up. On May 1st, we have Iron versus Steel with the National Museum of Industrial History's historian Mike Piersa, who will be talking about the difference between those two metals and how they're used and how they transformed, industry and how things are built. And then on May 4th, we're very lucky to be joined by Priya Satya of Stanford University, who will be talking about her book and her presentation on Quakers, guns, and the British Industrial Revolution, and a really fascinating story behind the Galtons, who are a British arms manufacturer, and how their pacifist ways interfered with their industry that they had. I also want to mention a couple ways that people can help the National Museum of Industrial History right now. Obviously, we're closed due to the coronavirus, and we're doing these great online programs for free for everyone to check out. So if you're able to, we really encourage people to go to our website at nmih.org and check out a few different ways that you can help support us right now. One of those ways is purchasing membership. Our memberships that are purchased right now while we're closed will be good for 1 year, starting the day that we reopen the museum. If you're using Amazon to purchase things online, please consider using Amazon Smile. A portion of what you buy will be donated to the National Museum of Industrial History. You can also adopt an artifact. Once we reopen, you can book future events. If you're thinking about the holidays already later this year, we'd be happy to host your event. You can reach out to us via our website. But for right now, I want to thank Martha again for joining us and switch it over to her.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be doing this. This is a bit of a new adventure for me. And I'm going to be talking about the history of the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor, specifically the industrial history thereof. And let's see if we've got this. This is a very interesting story and very relevant, not just to those of us who live here in Eastern Pennsylvania, but also to the entire nation, because this, in fact, is where the American Industrial Revolution began. Here in Eastern Pennsylvania, we had a very unique combination of geography, geology, and human genius. And those 3 factors all came together and wound up literally igniting the American Industrial Revolution. So let's go right into it, because some of this, of course, you folks may be quite familiar with, particularly the geography. So here is a map of much of Eastern Pennsylvania and New Jersey, of course, too. The significance here, of course, is that one of the things that shows pretty prominently are a whole series of canals. Easton is in the center here. At one point, Easton was the crossroads of the energy economy of the United States. But the significant part here is the rivers, specifically the Lehigh and the Delaware rivers. The Lehigh in particular, as well as the Schuylkill, a little bit to our west, were the 2 rivers that reached into the mountains that were where the anthracite coal beds were found. Wrong way. And the geology is this, the black spaces here on these maps, which stretch across Luzerne and Lackawanna counties to our north, Luzerne and Schuylkill counties in the center, and this long, long, narrow bed here, which is the one that we're particularly interested in because this was the one that was first tapped by the founders of the Lehigh Coal and Navigation System. This is known as the Southern Coal Field, also known as the Mammoth Vein. This was the single largest deposit of anthracite coal anywhere in the world. It still is, in fact. And even though it's no longer being exploited for a whole variety of reasons. But anthracite coal is the highest carbon content solid fuel. So when this was finally discovered at various times in the late 18th century, this proved to be a fuel that provided much, much more energy than any other fuel that humans had ever used in all of recorded history, the history of humans using fire. And that's because of its incredible high carbon content. So this is the geology, and the combination of the geography, the rivers that gave access to this area, and the geology are what finally was coupled with the human genius of a number of people who figured a way to not only exploit this incredible mineral storehouse of energy, but also to get it out of the ground economically, and then to transport it economically to places where people could use it. Because before we go any further, I should point out that the time period that we're talking about here, the late 18th and early 19th century, this part of Pennsylvania that we're looking at here, Schuylkill, Carbon, Lackawanna counties, were largely uninhabited. So there were no people living in those places to speak of, particularly after the Native Americans had been driven out, and they were very remote. By Western standards, these are not large mountains, but nevertheless, there was a complete absence of roads and very little way to transport anything, let alone something as heavy and bulky as coal, in a cost-effective manner, which did stop some people from attempting it. This is the first mine that was opened in what is now Summit Hill up in Carbon County. It was on top of Sharp Mountain, and you'll notice this looks like a quarry. This is exactly what it was. Anthracite was so incredibly abundant in the anthracite fields at that point that almost every story about its discovery is someone simply finding it on the ground. There was really no reason to dig tunnels at first, because all you needed to do to find the anthracite was scrape away the topsoil and what's known geologically as the overburden, and there was the coal. So the first mines were essentially quarries. Getting it out of the ground was not the problem, though, as I mentioned. This was the mine, as I said, in Summit Hill, which was opened in 1793 by a consortium of Philadelphia businessmen. And they could get the coal out of the ground very easily, but the problem was getting it to Philadelphia. Now, Philadelphia was the chief market anywhere in the middle Atlantic states. It was actually at that point, around 1800, still the largest city in North America. And Philadelphia and the rest of the eastern United States were already facing the country's first energy crisis. And that was because virtually all of the easily available hardwood had been cut down in the 150 years or so of European settlement in the middle Atlantic states. So wood was becoming scarce, it was becoming expensive. And this was a problem for just about everybody. People had to heat their homes with wood, they had to cook with wood, a lot of houses were built with it. And the people who were the most affected of this were the folks who were working in the iron business, blacksmiths, forgers, people who had to make horseshoes, all those sort of people, because the fuel that they needed to smelt iron and then to work it into useful products was wood, and that was becoming extremely expensive. So this mine opened and failed only about 6 or 7 years later because of the enormous cost of getting coal from up there in what is now Carbon County down to Philadelphia. Mostly it was taken by wagon load, and wagons in those days could not count on carrying more than 3 or 4 tons at most of a product. And then there were next to no roads anywhere between that part of Pennsylvania and down into Bucks County. So by the time coal got to Philadelphia, it was costing more than they could get the price for it. And also, nobody really knew what to do with it. Anthracite is very hard, and it's very difficult to get it to catch fire. So a lot of people did not recognize it as a fuel. And even despite the energy crisis, the wood shortage, there was a lot of resistance to it becoming used as fuel. So there are lots of stories of unsold wagon loads of coal being dumped on the streets in Philadelphia and used as paving. So the long and the short of it is that the first people who opened this mine actually went bankrupt, and it sat unused for quite some time. Now, in 1812, these two gentlemen, this is Josiah White on the left and Erskine Hazzard on the right, they were both Philadelphia businessmen. White was a Quaker. He had made a private fortune in the hardware business and had retired at the age of 30 to do good with his money. Erskine Hazzard was the son of the first postmaster of the United States and one of the founders of the first insurance company in this country. So he was from a wealthy family, and he was very well connected, a lot better than White was, despite White's wealth. They had gone into business together at a wire and nail mill that was on the banks of the Schuylkill River near the falls. And like everybody else who was attempting to make products out of iron, they were being really stressed by the price and the scarcity of wood. So they bought one of the wagon loads of anthracite that was still occasionally making its way down into Philadelphia. And fortunately for us, both these gentlemen were good letter writers and also very dedicated diarists, so we know this story. They bought this wagon load of coal, they put it in a furnace in their factory, and they tinkered with it for an entire day, and they could not get coal to catch fire. So they gave up, they shut the furnace, sent their workers home, and figured that this was just wasted money. But one of their workers realized a few hours later that he had forgotten his jacket in the mill, and he went back for it. When he opened the door to the building, it was warm inside, and when he looked at the furnace that they had shut and walked away from, it was red hot. And it turned out that what they had accidentally discovered, that the way you ignite anthracite coal is to place it in a closed system and give it an updraft of air. So according to White's diary, the worker summoned him in the middle of the night, and White in turn summoned their workers back, and in that night, they did a day's worth of work on this one load of coal. And so White and Hazzard realized that this was definitely a new source of energy that could possibly help their business immensely. However, this was in 1812, and it wasn't until 1818 that they, after attempting to get involved in a few other enterprises along the Schuylkill Navigation, decided to just go directly into the anthracite business. And in 1818, they purchased that abandoned mine in Summit Hill. But both of them, particularly White, realized that what had given everybody else difficulties, not to say complete failure, in getting into the anthracite business was not the coal itself, but the transportation issue. And White had a good idea. But that good idea hinged on them getting control of a water route from the mines to market in Philadelphia. And that water route was the Lehigh River. And that presented its own difficulties because the Lehigh, under normal circumstances, is shallow and rocky in most places, and for the most part, totally unsuitable as a transportation route for a heavy, bulky cargo like coal. So they decided that they would ask for help from the state of Pennsylvania. White and a German businessman who turned out to be a complete fraud after the fact, went to the legislature in Harrisburg, and they said, look, if we can extract this coal and bring it to market. It's going to be good for industry in the United States. It's going to be good for industry in Pennsylvania. It's going to be good for us. But they said to do this successfully, to transport this at a reasonable cost, you have to give us the Lehigh River. And possibly to their surprise, the legislature said, sir, sure, take the river, take the water rights, take the tributaries, take the land on either side of the river. It's all yours. We'll get it back in nothing flat. Everyone goes bankrupt in this crazy coal business. Well, Pennsylvania got the Lehigh River back in 1966. It was the only privately owned river in the United States from 1818 until 1966. And White's good idea was in this picture. You can see in here, this is a letterhead from a bill from 1827 from the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company. And as you can see by the banner, they were based in Mock Chunk, now the town of Jim Thorpe. And White's idea for taming the Lehigh River and making it useful for moving coal is visible here. You can see the dam across the Lehigh River. And at the end of the dam closest to us, it's a little difficult to pick out, but you can see what looks like a series of boxes. And that's essentially what they were, shallow boxes filled with coal. And they are coming through White's invention that was misnamed a bear trap dam. Now, the bear trap was really an interesting principle, and it was not a new one. Hydrostatic dams had existed for a long time. But what they did was the dams held back the water, made it about 3 or 4 feet deep behind the dam. And in that opening there, closest to the bank, there were 2 wooden gates. When water was allowed to flow through an opening in the upstream part of the dam and underneath those 2 gates, they overlapped, and the pressure of the water held them shut. This allowed the water behind the dam to build up to the point where it was deep enough that those shallow boxes full of coal, which carried altogether about 12 or 14 tons, could float safely over the rocks, which are everywhere in the Lehigh River. So they would line up all of these boxes of coal with a man at the front with a fending pole and the man at the stern, so to speak, with a sweep oar. And somebody at the head of the line would get off, turn what's known as a wicket, a handle, that shut off the flow of water underneath the drop gate. And with no water to hold it up, the gate would fall to the bottom. The water would shoot through there like the flume at an amusement park, and all the boats would ride over through that and be carried on this artificial flood down to the next dam. White built 13 of these dams between Mock Chunk and Easton on the Lehigh, most of them above Allentown because the river falls more sharply in that area than it does between Allentown and Easton. And by 1820, they were delivering nearly 30,000 tons of anthracite a year to Philadelphia. Because once they got it to Easton, it was possible to load it onto either Durham boats or even leave it on those rafts and float it down the Delaware to Philadelphia. And as fast as they could get it to Philadelphia, people bought it because it was a wonderful fuel as far as they were concerned. It made a very hot fire. It was cheap because this way of getting it there allowed them to deliver quite a great deal of coal without too much loss. And so it held the price down immensely. And best of all, for people who had been living for years and years in wood smoke, anthracite coal, when it burns, does not smoke. Now we know, of course, that coal puts off all sorts of other things that we really don't want in our air. But at the time, cheap, hot, and no smoke was an enormous selling point. So as much coal as they could get to Philadelphia, White and Hazzard's Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company, as it was dubbed, would get it there. Now, the current screen here shows another aspect of their genius, and it was genius, really, to look at a hole up in the wilderness, a wild and crazy river, and a new product that nobody really knew what to do with, and say, okay, we're going to make a success of this. And that is what they did. This particular piece of paper is what's called a patent, but it's essentially a receipt. And it's a little difficult to read, but it's dated December 16th, 1822. Received to Josiah White and Erskine Hazzard, $4.88 for the purchase money and interest on this day, given to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It paid for 214 acres and 140 perches of land in Pocono, spelled with a K, you'll notice, Township in Northampton County, because this was before Carbon County existed. And they bought all this land for $4.88. Cost them $10 to get the piece of paper, but so for $14.88, White and Hazzard and Lehigh Thule Navigation became the possessors of an enormous chunk of land. And that was only their first of many, many land purchases in the area, which is now on either side of what we call Lehigh Gorge. This land proved to be an incredible investment that actually outlived in value quite a bit of both the canal and the coal business. But at the time, what they were looking at was a ready supply of their own lumber for building dams, for building boats, and they were looking to the future as well. And this is a picture which is part of our collection at the National Canal Museum, that was painted in Mauch Chunk in 1832. Because the next step in the transport of coal, particularly after the Erie Canal was completed in 1825, was to turn that one-way navigation system just down the river to a two-way navigation system where they could carry the coal on boats down the Lehigh and down the Delaware to Philadelphia. They could be unloaded, and then they could be turned around and taken back upstream in a canal system that had a series of lift locks that act like water elevators. So in 1832, that system was completed. And the other brilliant thing that Josiah White devised for transporting coal was what we later became known as the Switchback Railroad, but at the time was simply the Gravity Railroad. The Gravity Railroad was a 9-mile route built on a stone road originally, and then on the first long railroad, all of 9 miles, from the mine at Summit Hill down to the river in Mauch Chunk. So this allowed the company to move carloads full of coal down the hill very rapidly from the mine and deliver it to the boats that were waiting on the river to begin their journey down the Lehigh and down the Delaware to market in Philadelphia. You may notice, if you look at this closely, that the boats in this picture in 1832 don't look much like what we think of the later canal boats. And they were, in fact, probably Durham boats. They were, however, mule-drawn and had to be steered. So they really became the first real coal transport boats. This picture was actually painted by a Swiss artist named Karl Bodmer, who had come to the United States with a prince from Germany who had come to actually study the Native Americans in the Midwest. But they spent quite a bit of time on the East Coast, and Bodmer painted the scenery in a lot of different places in Pennsylvania, including here in Mauch Chunk and also in Bethlehem. So Mauch Chunk, for the longest time, was the center of the coal mining business, and it grew from just a small collection of houses into a pretty prosperous town. This picture was taken from what we now know as Flagstaff, the park on the mountain just below Jim Thorpe. And it was taken about 1860. We don't exactly know the actual date, but there are some developments visible that had happened in only those 30 years, less than 30 years. To the far right, you can see the curving tracks of the Lehigh Valley Railroad. Alongside it is the entrance to the Lehigh Canal, You can see the entrance. There are boats in there, and they are headed into the very first lock, which was just below the dam, which is that black streak that's visible across the river in the middle. Boats are scattered all along the river there, and just a little ways upstream in the center of the picture is visible the bottom of the gravity railroad again. Also in the middle of the tree-like park there on the hill is Asa Packer's house. And Packer was also another one of the folks who made his fortune in, first of all, the anthracite business. Now, the two-way navigation was a remarkable achievement, 46 miles from Mach Chung to Easton. And it covered an elevation of over 350 feet between those two communities. So in between, there were 48 locks, and these allowed the boats to go down the river safely in a controlled environment where the depth of the water and the current in the waterway was very controlled, and also allowed the boats to go back up the mountain, essentially, because the locks are essentially a water elevator. This particular picture was taken in Lehigh Gap, probably in the early 20th century, because the smoke that is visible in the back is from the New Jersey Zinc Company. And there is a whole plethora of train tracks visible in this as well. This was a lock that is unfortunately no longer in existence, although some of the canal prism is still visible there, but there is no water in it. Route 248 is over a lot of this particular part of the canal. A little further downstream, this was the entrance lock into the canal just above Walnutport. And visible in the background there is the Lehigh and New England trestle, which crossed the gap. And just a little downstream from that, the toll bridge that went between the road that is now 248 and over to Slatington on the other side. Another view of the canal in the Lehigh Valley this time. This is Lock 44 in Freemansburg. The lock is still partially intact, although in very bad shape. This is one of the original lock tender houses that is still standing. The other one is in Walnutport. So this was a very, very successful transportation network. And it really allowed the development of an economy that began to be based more and more on coal. But even after they had been successfully moving a lot of anthracite, hundreds of thousands of tons, as well as some other canals were doing, the Schuylkill Canal, the Delaware and Hudson Canal. White and Hazzard, and just about every educated American, realized that the United States was lagging very, very far behind Britain and quite a bit of the rest of Western Europe in terms of industrial development. And that was because in England and Britain, they had begun to smelt iron using mineral fuel, coal, as early as 1718. And the advantage of mineral fuel, coal, that is that it allows you to produce iron at a far greater rate than using the old charcoal system, which was what was still being used entirely in the United States as late as the 1830s. So many people attempted to figure out how to use the anthracite coal to smelt iron. But the technology and the industrial knowledge in this country didn't exist that would allow them to design a furnace that was strong enough to contain the heat of an anthracite fire. So White and Hazzard and any number of other people did a lot of experimentation, and no one was particularly successful. And in fact, there were quite a few spectacular failures in the incidents of exploded furnaces and the like. But finally, in 1837, White and Hazzard and the managers of the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company became aware of an ironmaster in Wales. His name was David Thomas, and he worked for a man named George Crane, who owned the Inniskedwin Ironworks in Wales. Now, Inniskedwin was just about over top of one of the few anthracite veins in the British Isles. And Thomas and Crane had experimented with using the anthracite in the furnace. Not only that, George Crane had purchased the rights to the hot blast system, which was a way of heating air before it was forced into the blast furnace. And the combination of the heat of anthracite and the heat from the air being forced into the blast furnace yielded in 1838 very large quantities of very high quality iron. So this proved extremely successful for them, and it attracted a lot of attention. So Lehigh Navigation decided that best thing to do was to send Erskine Hazzard to Wales to secure the patent rights for the process for North America. And when he arrived there in the late fall of 1838, Hazzard very quickly determined that, in fact, what they needed to do was to persuade someone to come to Pennsylvania and do the process for them. And George Crane very graciously suggested that they try to hire David Thomas. Now, Thomas was a little reluctant to leave Wales. He had an elderly mother who he feared he would never see again if he left his native country. He was also nearly 40. He was very successful in his field, very well respected. And to start all over with a new enterprise in a new country seemed a bit daunting, but his wife persuaded him that their sons would have more opportunity in Pennsylvania than if they stayed in Wales. And as it turned out, she was right. So Thomas signed a contract with Erskine Hazzard on New Year's Eve in 1838, and he arrived in Pennsylvania the following July. He broke the ground along Lock 36 in what's now Catasauqua in August of that year. The reason that they had bought land, which was just farmland, along Lock 36 was because of the water power that was available from that part of the canal, owing to the change in the drop between the guard lock at what's now North Catasauqua and Lock 36. So first thing that Thomas had to do actually was construct a water wheel to power his blowing engines, which must have seemed like being thrown back in history because he was used to having steam engines that did that job. But in this country, we didn't make enough iron, nor did we have the technology to make large steam engines. So small ones, yes, that burned wood and powered boats, but large steam engines fired by coal were non-existent. So this water wheel that's visible in this drawing by Dennis Gerhardt was actually 24 feet wide and 12 feet in diameter. So it had a pretty good push to force the air through the stoves, which were also anthracite burning, which are there on the ground, and force this heated air into the blast furnace. Thomas actually built the first furnace in 11 months, and he put it into blast on the 3rd of July. On the 4th of July, 1840, he made his first cast. And on that day, he made more iron than a charcoal-fired furnace, which is all that had been available in the United States since the arrival of the Europeans. That he made more iron than a charcoal-fired furnace could make in a week, in one day. And that was essentially the beginning of the American Industrial Revolution. This is really the birthplace because it was the first time that large quantities of high-quality iron could be made in a hurry in this country. And this really did spark an industrial revolution because this was the first place that brought together the geology and the geography, the anthracite and the transportation system. The transportation system that could bring in the raw materials and carry away the finished product to market. And this led to an explosion of industry like this in the Lehigh Valley. This is a picture of Catasauqua. In 1854, only 14 years later, what had been no community whatsoever, just a cluster of houses a little bit downstream at the neighborhood known as Beery's Bridge, now was a community of about 1,200 people. There were 5 furnaces in blast there. And David Thomas had constructed himself the very large house that you can see in the upper left-hand corner of the picture. You can see how the canal boats were on the canal as well. There was a bridge across the Lehigh, and what is not visible very easily in this picture is the next phase of development that grew out of this system, and that was the arrival of the Lehigh Valley Railroad in 1854. But before we jump ahead to that point, it's interesting to look at the rapid growth of the anthracite iron industry along the Lehigh Navigation. This is the Glendon Ironworks, which was begun 2 years later in 1842 by an English ironmaster whose name was William Firmstone. Now, Firmstone had been hired by a group of investors in Boston who ran a foundry in Massachusetts. And having heard of Thomas's success, they decided that it would be the best thing to get their iron made in Pennsylvania and brought to their foundry in Massachusetts. So they hired Firmstone, and on David Thomas's advice, he leased this patch of land along the Lehigh Canal, Section 8 of the Lehigh Canal, just a little bit west of Easton. In fact, what you're looking at here is what Hugh Moore Park, which is the home of the National Canal Museum and the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor, this is what Hugh Moore Park looked like in the 1880s. And we like to say that this is really a picture that is a microcosm of the entire corridor, because here we have the canal, we have two canal boats, 2 sections of the same boat, probably. The one to the left is still loaded with coal, and the pile of coal is visible beyond it on the bank. The one on the right has been emptied. Beyond it is the ironworks, a very successful ironworks. And in the foreground are the tracks of the Lehigh Valley Railroad. So this is everything that talks about the transportation of the anthracite from the mine to market, all rolled into one picture here. As well, David Thomas and his sons and several other investors put money into what became known as the Thomas Ironworks. And this was their first facility in a town that was created to house the workers for the company that was known as Hackendaqua. In the foreground here is Guard Lock 6, which is a very clear view of the way the canal system worked. The dam that's visible made the river deep enough and slow enough for about a mile going back upstream towards Northampton for the canal boats to ride on the river and the towpaths to be built right on the bank of the river. Then when they reached the next stretch of the ditch, the slanted wall to the left in this picture is what's known as the feeder gate. And this allowed water from the river to come in and water the next part of the ditch of the canal. And the boats would come in from what was known as the slack water through the gate that is in the foreground of this picture. So this was a really genius system. It meant that the Lehigh Canal always had water in it, which was actually a problem for a lot of canals in the 19th century. But with the dam system and the slack water system, as long as there was water in the river behind the dams, there was water in the canal. So this became a really reliable way of transportation, even after the coming of the railroads, as a matter of fact. But time did sort of march on, and this building here is the result of the confluence of railroads and coal. It was the first building of what became Bethlehem Iron. This is an old drawing. Its provenance is quite uncertain, but this was the very first office building of Bethlehem Iron. And this came about because Asa Packer, who I mentioned earlier, was the genius behind the construction and completion of the Lehigh Valley Railroad, which went into direct competition for carrying coal with the Lehigh Coal and Navigation. It was no accident that the tracks of the Lehigh Valley Railroad absolutely paralleled the route of the Lehigh Navigation from the coal regions at Mock Chunk and down to Easton, and then eventually on to New Jersey. So the problem there, however, was that to build a railroad, reliable rails were the worst problem. And the best rails at the time were being made by a man named Moses Taylor at the Lackawanna Ironworks in Scranton. And the problem with that was that Moses Taylor, at least there was a problem in Asa Packer's mind, Moses Taylor was also in competition with Packer for railroads and the coal business. And so Packer did not like the idea of giving any business to his main business rival. So he directed Robert Sayre, who was the very young engineer who had completed the construction of the Lehigh Valley Railroad, to then also open an iron business and to make it possible to make really good, high-quality rails for his own railroad. And that was really the genesis of what became Bethlehem Iron and, of course, later became Bethlehem Steel. It was created in Bethlehem in the early 1860s to make railroad tracks available exclusively for the Lehigh Valley Railroad. The Civil War held up the process, and they didn't actually begin to roll their own rails until 1863. And that was partly due to the arrival of the man whose birthday here is celebrated in this photograph very much later, 1892, as a matter of fact. In the center of this picture, he's a little difficult to pick out, but he is two people to the right of the man in the white suit, is John Fritz. Sayre persuaded John Fritz to leave a position at the Cambria Ironworks, where he had invented a machine known as the three-high rail system. Without going into the technical details, the three-high rail system produced far superior iron rails to anything else that was being made in the United States at the time. And Sayre was savvy enough to persuade Asa Packer to dangle a significant amount of money in front of Fritz and have him relocate with his patent system to Bethlehem and to employ it for a time exclusively at Bethlehem Ironworks. And Fritz did this. He went on to initiate an enormous number of other important innovations that led to the steady growth of Bethlehem Iron from a fairly small and regional company into a very important national one. But first of all, what Fritz did was to persuade Sayre and the other owners and managers of Bethlehem Iron to go into the steel business. This is a photograph, possibly even taken by Fritz, certainly from his own personal collection, of the first open hearth system that was constructed. They did use a Bessemer process for a time, but Fritz was not particularly enamored of that, and so he rapidly pushed them into adopting an open hearth system. And once this was established, it allowed them to make different types of steel, and this opened up the possibility of making several different kinds of products, different from what they had made before. So this contributed to Bethlehem moving beyond just simply the iron business and going into the steel business as well, starting in the 1870s. Eventually, thanks to the needs that were expressed by the United States Navy beginning in the 1880s, and Fritz's accomplishments in terms of forging, Bethlehem also became the United States Navy's principal supplier of armor plate for battleships. And that is what is being produced here in this early 20th century. Of course, by this point, this was now an enormous company, became the second largest steel company in the United States eventually. But this was extremely hot and heavy and dangerous work. It's notable to look at all of these workers here and realize that they are not wearing anything like protective clothing. And nevertheless, the company grew rapidly and just about employed just about everyone who came and wanted to have a job. And this became a huge attraction for a number of immigrants who were beginning to flood into the country, particularly from the Eastern European countries. This led, of course, to the development of South Bethlehem, for a long time as a separate borough, and certainly as a melting pot of a community that had at one point as many as 60 or so different ethnic groups living in it, building their churches, speaking their languages, and many of the men in the families, of course, working in the steelworks. So even before the steel really sort of picked up, another major industry had its birthplace here in the Lehigh Valley, and that was the cement industry. Ironically, or maybe not, because this seems to have been the trigger for a lot of what happened here, the cement industry originally came about because of the construction of the canal. One of the contributions of canal building, both in Britain and then here in the United States, was the revival of the knowledge of how to make hydraulic cement, which is the sort that hardens underwater. And the canal engineer Canvas White, who had worked on the Erie Canal, where he had been sent to Britain and came back from Britain with the recipe for hydraulic cement, subsequently helped to build the Lehigh Navigation. And so they discovered deposits of limestone in two places along the route of the Lehigh Navigation in the 1820s, one near Palmerton, what's now Palmerton in the Lehigh Gap, and the other near the village that was known as Siegfried's, which is now part of Northampton. And so they were making small quantities of hydraulic cement in kilns in these two locations, and it was used to help construct locks and to plug locks in the leaks in the canal and other things. So for quite some time, there was a very, very small cement industry. But in the 1860s, there was, when the Lehigh Valley Railroad came down the west bank of the Lehigh River and blasted their way to making a level roadbed, they uncovered large deposits of limestone rock. And this led several people to investigate the possibility of using it to make cement. The first really successful person, and in fact, the man who held the patent for Portland cement in the United States, was a man from Allentown named David Saylor. And his Copley Cement Works was the first manufacturer of Portland cement, beginning in the late 1860s. This was another business that took off very quickly, and it was entirely due to the fact that another geologic accident, in this case, the presence of the most perfect blend of limestone for making Portland cement just about anywhere in the world, is found underneath parts of Warren, Northampton, Lehigh, and eastern Berks counties. It's known as the Jacksonburg Formation. And it is a combination of limestones which simply can be pulled out of the ground, kilned, and turned into Portland cement, which was the first really most useful building material of its kind in the modern era. The Romans knew about it, but that was knowledge that was lost for centuries until the British revived it, quite by accident. And then again, it became established here in the Lehigh Valley. So from the opening of Saylor's cement plant in what is now Copley, the cement industry as well spread very rapidly all along the Jacksonburg Formation. From Northampton County, there's still a cement plant in Stockertown, and across the area that is now Nazareth and Bath, known as the Cement Belt, and across the Egypt, Copley, Northampton area, and into eastern Berks County. Copley Cement became an enormous operation, although it was eventually eclipsed in size and capacity by the Atlas Company, which was built across the river in Northampton. In the foreground here of this image from their letterhead is something that you can still partly see if you happen to go to Copley, to Saylor Park. And those are the stacks of the Schaffer kilns. The Schaffer kilns were the last word in vertical kiln technology. They were erected in the early 1890s. They were continuously fed, which was the real breakthrough there. And they would have been very successful if it had not been for the fact that the first horizontal rotary kiln had been installed by a Spanish-American entrepreneur named Jose de Navarro, just about 3/4 of a mile upstream 5 years earlier. The irony is that the Schaffer kilns, much diminished, are however still standing in Copley Park. And this is really an important site because, not only because it was where the American cement industry began, but those Schaffer kilns that remain are the only ones still standing anywhere in the world. And of course, the cement industry is still viable and going in our area. So that is one link to our industrial heritage that is still really strong and vital as an industry. This is a picture of what was apparently the first or one of the early modifications that Navarro made of his original horizontal kiln. This picture was taken in the 1930s, shortly before what became Universal Atlas Cement demolished their original plant in Copley and consolidated their entire operation in an enormous collection of cement plants on the Northampton side. Another look at another one of the Nazareth and Bath area mills. And of course, as anyone who has seen the Lehigh Valley from the air knows that our cement quarries, whether in use or abandoned, are still very visible parts of the landscape here. But you can pretty much only see them from overhead. This was a company known as Penn-Dixie, and they were located between Bath and Nazareth and had actually 4 different plants at various times. The Lehigh District, as it is known, was the largest producer of cement in the world between roughly 1900 and 1920. The New Jersey Zinc Company was another actually early, the zinc industry was a very early industry in the Lehigh Valley. Zinc oxide was first produced, as a matter of fact, in a mill on the south bank of the Lehigh in what's now South Bethlehem, in an area that was eventually taken over by Bethlehem Steel. The New Jersey Zinc Company eventually consolidated all of its operations in both Pennsylvania and New Jersey on a site in what is now Palmerton, and as well as building the world's largest zinc plant at the time, they also built one of the first from the ground up company towns, which was is of course still in existence, even though the zinc company is gone. The zinc company also relied on transportation of the canal, and interestingly enough was one of the final beneficiaries of canal transport, because after the navigation closed down in the 1930s, one operation that continued was the dredging of coal dirt from behind the dams, from the river, and from the canal itself. And the dredges would wash the coal dust, dirt as it was, and it was still useful fuel. And then they would haul it up to the zinc works, and it was burned in the smelters. So that was really the last operation of Lehigh Coal and Navigation from the standpoint of transport by canal boat. And the beneficiary there was the zinc works. Now, Bethlehem in particular, and the entire Lehigh Valley remained at the forefront of American industrialization well into the 20th century, as we know. What is a little bit less well known is the fact that Bethlehem Steel was essentially the arsenal of the Western Allies, particularly in World War I. Even though Britain was in and of itself a mighty industrial power, when faced with the difficulties and the challenges of World War I, very early on, the British military and political establishment approached a lot of American businesses. And given that Bethlehem Steel was already the premier defense provider of materials, particularly for navies, they came to Bethlehem, or actually it went the other way. This is Charles Schwab, who was the man who turned Bethlehem Steel into the great industrial behemoth that it became. The man on the top hat is David Lloyd George, who in this picture at the time was the Secretary of War of Britain and eventually became the wartime prime minister. Britain worked all sorts of subterfuges to get Bethlehem Steel's armaments and armor plate around the Woodrow Wilson's embargoes so as not to compromise American neutrality before the United States entered the war. And Schwab was equally enthusiastic to do this. In fact, to the point where they manufactured submarine components in Bethlehem and in other Bethlehem Steel facilities, and then transferred them to an assembly plant in Canada, which allowed the British to buy American-made submarines, but not to compromise American neutrality in doing so, because Canada was part of the empire. So Schwab and his other executives made quite a few trips, some of them somewhat secret, to negotiations to sell armaments to Britain, all of which, of course, stopped being a problem once the United States entered the war. Industrially, the ironworks and the steelworks were never employers of women except in wartime. This is a World War II era picture, World War I era picture of women who were hired to weld fins onto bombs. Apparently, in some cases, women were given somewhat dangerous work too, and they certainly were doing men's work in the absence of an adequate male workforce. But once the men came back from war, these kind of industrial jobs for women disappeared. One thing that grew out of the war, although not until afterward, was an aviation industry in Bristol, Pennsylvania, which is the southern terminus of the Delaware Canal, which we haven't really spoken much about. But the Delaware Canal was built by the state of Pennsylvania, very quickly here, between Easton and Bristol in the 1830s, and it became Lehigh Navigation's vital water link to being able to load coal on boats in the mountains of Pennsylvania and to leave it on those boats until they were offloaded at Lehigh Navigation's piers in Philadelphia. Bristol was the southern terminus of the Lehigh Navigation, and it suffered economically from various changes in the way coal was used and transported. But nevertheless, always seemed to find a way to maintain its status as the manufacturing center of Bucks County. In this particular case, what we're looking at is clearly an airplane, and if you look closely, you can see the Batwing bomb insignia on its side there. This is an Army Air Corps light bomber that was built on the site of a former shipyard in Bristol in the 1920s. There were a succession of companies which eventually became part of the famous Wright Curtiss Company. And they produced aviation, airplanes, also various aviation components, all the way up to and including the beginning of the space age, because the envelope for the first couple of weather satellites were actually produced in Bristol as well. So industry in the entire corridor made its way all the way from the very, very beginnings of industrialization, and even before that, all the way up to the earliest parts of the space age. But eventually, when the coal business died away, the railroads as well began to dwindle. This picture was taken sometime in the 20s, or possibly the early 30s, and it is of the Lehigh River, just a little ways above Jim Thorpe. It was still Mach Chunk at the time. And you can see here that rail transport was still an enormously important part of the transportation network, both passenger and freight. Now this is pretty much where the Delaware and Lehigh Trail, the Dnl Trail, is on this particular site here up through the gorge. And that's what the trail does, is that it traces and memorializes and reuses the same transportation network that brought the anthracite, brought the coal from mine to market, and basically brought the United States into the industrial age. The other huge industry that became preeminent here in Pennsylvania, less so for the canal, although this is a picture of a mill in Bethlehem that depended on the canal, was the silk business. Silk industry moved out of Paterson, New Jersey, or expanded from Paterson, New Jersey, into northeastern Pennsylvania starting in the 1890s. And this was an industry that came to Pennsylvania because of its human resources rather than its natural ones. And those human resources were actually the wives, daughters, and young sons of the men in northeastern Pennsylvania who worked in the mines and on the railroads. What the silk industry needed was docile, moderately educated, semi-skilled labor, and they needed these women and children to work in the mills where originally they were doing the less skilled work in the silk business, which is winding and doubling and basically preparing silk yarn for being made into silk goods in larger mills. Very rapidly, this expanded down into the Lehigh Valley and up from Philadelphia into enormous silk weaving mills. And this particular one was the Saccoit Mill in Bethlehem along the canal. And as you can see here, this was a mill that was in fact powered by anthracite, which was delivered by boat. Anthracite was the preferred fuel. It was another attraction of the coal regions in particular for the silk business because, as we mentioned really early, anthracite burns really cleanly. And to a silk manufacturer, keeping things clean and the silk nice and pure and smooth and well worked was a very, very attractive proposition. So not too many mills were along the canal, but this particular one was. And by 1913, Eastern Pennsylvania became not only the leading silk producing area of the United States, but of the world. And that primacy existed in Pennsylvania until about 1930. The Depression put a pretty good dent in the silk business, and a lot of the textile business moved to the south of the United States first, and then eventually, beginning in the 1960s and 70s, out of the country completely. But for a very, very long time, silk was one of the chief, if not in some years, the chief employer of people, not just women, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This picture was taken in my father's mill, actually in Allentown, which was the last silk mill in the Lehigh Valley. As you can see, the workers were rather elderly, and so was the machinery. But it was a very productive mill, and my father made silk necktie material for a high-end menswear company called Countess Mara, and also a high-end inside flag material known as Bemberg, which was mostly bought by the government. But the industry really has dwindled to the point where it was no longer sustainable. And this mill closed in 1989. One last look at Bristol and its aviation. This kind of looks like an ancestor of the Starship Enterprise, but it was in fact a seaplane, which was the last real aviation piece that was built in Bristol itself. This picture was actually taken on the Delaware River outside of Bristol. This was known as the Pathfinder, and it was an innovative plane in a number of cases, not least of which in the fact that it was welded and it was all stainless steel, which kept it light and durable. The problem with it, however, was the price tag. In real $1935, it was $35,000, and that was far too steep a price for a Depression time. So only 6 of these were ever built, and one of them is actually still airworthy and apparently makes appearances now and then at the museum where it is kept in the upper Northwest. But that was pretty much the end of flying pieces altogether. For the rest of the time, the aviation business in Bristol made tail assemblies and other components of planes, but didn't actually build airplanes anymore. One last major industrial development occurred in Bucks County in the 1950s, and this was the construction of the Fairless Steelworks by United States Steel in Falls Township. The attraction of this site in Falls Township, which was actually one of the earliest English settlements of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, even before Philadelphia, is the fact that this is still accessible on the tidal Delaware to seagoing ships. And so United States Steel was looking for an East Coast facility that was accessible from the ocean. And they bought up 3,500 acres of Falls Township and built this first and last steel mill that was constructed from the ground up, an integrated steel mill, where they made iron here in the blast furnaces that are visible in the foreground, and then converted it to steel in the open hearth furnaces that are visible in the background. The problem with this plant was that when it was completed in 1953, United States Steel made a conscious decision not to install basic oxygen technology. And so consequently, this mill never produced an adequate quantity of steel in any given year. It opened in 1954. The layoffs began only 20 years later. And in 1993, combination of the changes in the steel industry in this country and overseas caused it to be shut down completely. It took more than 10 years to dismantle it. The environmental remediation is still going on, which is sad considering that this was once some of the most fertile farmland in Bucks County. And it's the challenges of trying to turn it into a different sort of port have not met with very much success. And so this is still largely undeveloped area, even though United States Steel does maintain a small plating plant on this site. Unfortunately, a lot of the area is a landfill for New York garbage. So to end on what's a bit of a downer note, which really shouldn't be, because one of the things that I found in writing this book was that there are many, many positive signs for optimism of the future. The epilogue of the book is largely conversations with two gentlemen who run economic development corporations, Don Cunningham here in the Lehigh Valley, Larry Newman up in Luzerne County. And they both point to a lot of very positive developments, chief of which, in both of their estimations, still remains our location, for one thing, still, for better or for worse, within a easy drive of a major chunk of the population of this country. So our geography still does matter, and our geology perhaps less so, but the real power here now is they both believe the people who live here. They still both see a very strong work ethic. They both see a very strong and positive attitudes towards education, both academic education and career training. And in both cases, they both point to the fact that we are now no longer dependent economically on one or two enormous industries, that the diversification of industry and business in this area is one of our greatest strengths. So even though things have changed, they are definitely still going forward. And so that is one of the reasons why the DNL thought that it was very important to not only preserve this transportation pathway that I've mentioned multiple times, this route that carried coal from mine to market, so that we remember our heritage, but then also to reuse it and to make it useful and relevant to the people who live in the corridor today, not only as a lovely way of getting outside and getting good, healthy exercise, but in the creation of a whole new set of businesses that support and are supported by this outdoor recreation route, which is also becoming something of a transportation route again. So the DNL is committed to preserving that pathway, preserving our memories, and also promoting the good health and the economic development of everybody and every place here in the DNL corridor. So thanks very much to NMIH. I have worked closely with those folks for a long time, and our positions and our collections and our activities beautifully complement each other. And so I'm very grateful to have been able to reach their audience with this talk.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Martha. We really appreciate you being able to be here with us. And thank you to the National Canal Museum and the Delaware and Lehigh National Heritage Corridor for letting us borrow you for this talk. I also want to mention, check those guys out on social media as well. Give their pages a like. They do a lot of fantastic stuff. I believe the book that you wrote on this topic that you gave today is available on their website. So
yes, and on NMIH's as well.
Yep. And if you guys enjoyed the talk, please, I encourage everybody to grab your book. There's a ton more interesting history in there. I read through it over the quarantine, so I was very, very impressed with everything that's in there. So it's a great book.
Thank you.
I also want to remind everybody, this is just one of many different presentations that we've had for the National Museum of Industrial History for a virtual museum. If you haven't caught the previous talks, they're available on our website at nmih.org. And we have a couple of new talks coming up. One is Iron versus Steel with our historian, Mike Piersa. That'll be on May 1st. And on May 4th, we have Quakers, Guns, and the British Industrial Revolution with Priya Satya, who's from Stanford University. So look forward to those talks coming up. We have a lot of different stuff in the works, so we're going to be adding a lot of new content coming up in the next couple of days. And again, if anybody's in a position to be able to help the museum, there's a couple different ways, including purchasing memberships, using Amazon Smile, which costs you nothing, and adopting artifacts on our website. And you can find all that information more at nmih.org. And I just want to thank Martha again for joining us, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.